Welcome back to Criminal Procedure, Chapter 14. And we've been talking about the legal liabilities of law enforcement officers, which is basically how do we handcuff some of the officers and their actions, right? And so as we, okay, it doesn't, there we go. And so to help us understand this particular topic, we have the 5 important cases that we've chosen for this particular chapter. And let me just say this, I'm so glad that we are working together in this particular format, because after the storm, I mean, my allergies are completely out of control. I'm going to try to get that under control so that you're not having to be exposed to any of what's going on back here. But anyway, so let's just move on, right? Okay, so we've talked about these cases. I think when we stopped, okay, we ended our conversation with Jessica, right? And so Jessica had filed a lawsuit against the police department because her soon-to-be ex-husband had taken the children without her consent. And the courts had also had some very strict guidelines on his access to these girls. Also, keep in mind that I kept emphasizing that only 2 of the 3 girls were his biological daughters. One of them was not. And the reason that I bring that to your attention is because while the courts might have been hesitant about trying to side on whether or not a biological parent should or shouldn't have access to their children, they definitely could set some boundaries for the child that was not his. And it was just interesting to me how the courts ruled on this particular situation, because they kind of ignored that piece. They ignored that one of the daughters was not his biological daughter. So in fact, he did not have the same authority over that daughter than that he had with the other 2 biological daughters. The courts decided to instead just limit their assessment to, did we follow the rules? And in this particular case, they were very clear that due process does not apply to these types of rules. Due process applies to laws, right? So as a result of that, the restraining order that was in place did not violate any of the constitutional protections. So this was a very disturbing way of deciding on this particular case. And I don't know. We'll just leave it at that. And then this particular case is, hang on a second, because this thing's, yeah, this thing's acting up. Sorry. So Deputy Scott was in a high-speed chase with Harris for a traffic violation. And the traffic violation was simply for speeding, okay? So one of the things that he did is that because he was driving at a high rate of speed and obviously already had his lights and siren on and everything else, and he noticed that Scott was not going to comply. He also felt that Scott was not only a danger to himself, but he might present a danger to others. So he felt the need to figure out how he could slow down the vehicle. So in the process of doing that, Scott ended up ramming the back of the vehicle, believing that Harris would be a danger to others if he remained behind the wheel, right? So the chase was videotaped and entered into evidence, which nowadays, this is a pretty common thing. It wasn't so common back then, but fortunately, they did capture what was taking place, right? So as a result of getting rammed in the back, Harris did end up losing control of his vehicle, and as a result, became a quadriplegic because of the injuries that he had sustained from this particular event. So his argument was that he felt that this was, again, a violation of his Fourth Amendment rights. And the Fourth Amendment right that he is focusing on is that he felt that this was an unreasonable seizure. And remember, we talked about seizure. I remind you over and over that a seizure, it can also address the arrest, right? So he felt that the arrest was made unreasonably. He felt, and basically implying that there could have been other ways that could have avoided him ending up losing control of the vehicle and becoming a quadriplegic, right? So according to the higher courts, they felt that Scott's actions were in fact reasonable under the Fourth Amendment. And regardless of how you want to take a look at this, remember, one of the things that I remind you about is that officers always have at least 1 degree higher authorization when it comes to force. Okay, so in this particular case, because we're talking about a moving vehicle, the level of force that Scott did end up using is considered to be one level of force higher than that of the driver of Harris, right? When we're thinking about alternatives, I mean, there were other things that could be done, but according to the courts, they said, yep, your actions were justified on based on the evidence because they were able to see that, and they could understand that Scott's perception that Harris was a threat to other drivers and pedestrians required a higher level of force to get him stopped and off the streets. The fact that he ended up in an accident and as a quadriplegic was not Scott's fault, and that Scott, in fact, looking at this particular case, is justified even if Harris had lost his life in this particular incident as a result of his actions. So this was very interesting because, we can see where the higher courts just kind of got very flexible with this particular decision. And I think that the reason that they were able to do that or come to that conclusion is because of the videotape. So they were able to watch his videotape and understand exactly why Scott made the decisions that he made. So just a real quick, hang on, just a real quick highlight to everything that we talked about for this particular chapter is just remember Harlow versus Fitzgerald. The main point here was that not all government officials have immunity, right? So that was a very important decision because up to that point, we just assumed that if they're a government official, that they were going to they actually had the authority to exercise their immunity for some of the decisions that they make. And the higher court said, no, no, you don't. And then Groh versus Ramirez, this was just deciding that the execution of invalid warrants is not protected, right? So this was a huge shift when we take a look at it, because oftentimes the higher courts, at least in the past, have said, as long as you did it in good faith, we're fine. Because you did, when you applied for this warrant, it's okay that you assumed that the judge, checked off all the boxes and whatnot. But in this particular case, the higher courts kind of came back and said, no, you've got a responsibility to make sure that the warrant that you're getting ready to execute is actually a valid warrant, meaning that you also checked off all the boxes. And so this is the very first time that we see where the higher courts put a little bit more responsibility on the officer's shoulders for doing this. Brousseau and Hagen, this was where they just determined that shooting a fleeing suspect that presents a danger to others is not a violation. And this is the one where Officer Brousseau had ended up shooting this young man in the back, right, through the Jeep, and ended up shooting him in the back. So just make it clear that shooting a fleeing suspect is not the same thing as shooting a fleeing suspect that presents continued danger to others. And so I just want to make sure that we got that clarified. And then the restraining order, right? So the restraining order is not a protective order. It is not a law. And because it is just considered to be a process, processes are not protected by the Constitution. And so, we kind of threw around some conversations about that and how we might be able to educate people that find themselves in these types of situations and help them to document and file for the right type of protection, right? And then, of course, the final case was the one that we just talked about, which is Scott versus Harris. And in this particular case, they determined that use of force is allowed when others are at risk, right? So I'm just going to hit those 5 for now because we have a second, and then we can kind of go over the rest of that particular lecture. Hang on, let me stop this for a minute and I'm gonna pull up the next one. Hang on. Oh my gosh, what, okay. All right. So, all right. Now we are, and I'm just going to hit a few highlights on this one. because we're still going to get together for class, obviously, and but I want to make sure that, let's see here. Here we go. Here we go. Let me see what you're seeing. Hang on. Just give me a minute. Okay. All right. So, and then just so we're clear, when we come back into classroom on Friday, then I'm going to wrap up chapter 14 and wrap up chapter 15. But what I absolutely wanted to make sure of is that we had at least the top 5 for both of these chapters. So I'm gonna go ahead and swing through these very quickly. So chapter 15 is really about electronic surveillance and obviously, and the war on terror. And obviously, the electronic surveillance has really become the forefront of a lot of what we're doing now in the world of law enforcement. And so we wanted, and so some of the cases that we're going to be talking about today are going to be very quickly outdated because I'm sure that we have a slew of cases that are being questioned right now. We just haven't had any updated decisions on those yet, especially for this particular textbook, right? So here are our 5 important cases for this particular chapter dealing with surveillance. And let me just kind of get through those with you very quickly. And actually, Katz versus the United States, this is a 1967 case. And we've talked about this in different settings in some of the other courses, because this is actually one of the first, among the very first cases that we looked at when it came to technology and electronics and that sort of thing, right? So just a little bit of background on Katz. Katz was not a good guy, and I tell you this all the time, right? Every single one of these cases, they're not good guys. So Katz was suspected of gambling. For those of you unaware, gambling is illegal in most states. We're starting to see some changes nowadays, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is legal all the way across the nation. Gambling has been one of those big topics of conversation, much like marijuana and some of the other things, right? So Katz, what he would do is that he had a whole slew of clients that would place some pretty big bets, usually like on games, right? So football games, maybe horse races, just different things. And I think one of the most common terms back then was, it was called a bookie. Bookie was someone that would receive phone calls or even sometimes, in-person interactions, and where people would place bets on certain teams and things like that, right? And so he knew that he was being investigated. And so one of the things that he started doing was that he didn't trust his home anymore. He felt that because he felt that he was being investigated by the feds, that instead of taking the bets on instead of taking the bets through I'm sorry, I just got a message from one of the students asking about a course. Interesting. All right. So anyway, So Katz didn't trust his own home phone because he thought that that they had bugged his house and all of that. So what he was doing was that he was using a public phone. And the reason that he was using this public phone is because in his mind, he's thinking, well, they're not going to be able to put a wiretap on a public phone. Like, that's ridiculous. It's a public phone. That means that a lot of different people would be using this phone, and everybody that uses this phone would have a certain expectation of privacy. And so in his mind, he felt that taking the bets or placing the bets through the use of a public phone would not compromise, he wouldn't get compromised over this, right? However, the feds did end up wiretapping the public phone that Katz was using. The FBI did record Katz making gambling transactions without a warrant, believing that since the payphone was public, it wasn't necessary to obtain a warrant. So the evidence obtained, so the argument was that the evidence was actually obtained illegally. He felt that this was a violation of his Fourth Amendment rights to be secure in his personal effects, meaning his conversations and all of that, right? And so when the court took a look at this particular case and all the circumstances around it, they decided that the Fourth Amendment does protect the phone conversation, okay? And so if you can just imagine, the feds were going, yeah, but this was a public phone. There shouldn't have been an expectation of privacy because it was a public phone. And this is where the higher courts emphasized that the Fourth Amendment protects people, not places. So it didn't matter that the phone was in a public place. And since Katz was expecting a certain level of privacy when he was using this telephone, that the feds, when the feds decided to wiretap that phone, they actually violated Katz's rights. All right. So looking at the next one, which is Kylo versus United States. So this one, the feds use thermal imaging. Now, keep in mind, this was in 2001. So thermal imaging was very, very new to our world of technology. So the feds were using this thermal imaging device to scan a residential area because they believed that Danny was growing marijuana. And a federal judge did issue a warrant based on evidence obtained by the thermal imaging. So they used the thermal imaging as probable cause to apply for the warrants. And they had received this information through informants, and then they had already looked at his utility bills, and they saw where his utility bills were kind of skyrocketing, at what points they began skyrocketing. And so when they did the thermal imaging, they saw some unusual hotspots, right? So after the warrant had been issued and the feds went out there, they found the marijuana. So the argument was that the heat emanating from the home should not justify a search. And they felt that this too was an unreasonable search and a violation of the Fourth Amendment rights. So the court held that the search does violate the Fourth Amendment right because the probable cause was established mostly by the thermal imaging. And this was incredibly important because what the courts are really saying is that before you could even conduct the thermal imaging, you needed a warrant for to get permission to do the thermal imaging. And then you needed a second warrant to go and do the search to find the marijuana. So this was a very interesting case because it's also kind of a telltale as to where we're heading in terms of technology and what the expectations are from our higher courts, right? So let's talk about Hamdi. Hamdi was born in the United States to Saudi Arabian immigrant parents who were at the time were living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. After Hamdi was born, his parents returned to Saudi Arabia when Hamdi was a child. Okay, so he really did grow up in Saudi Arabia. Now, having grown up in Saudi Arabia has some very different expectations than we do here in the US. So it wasn't uncommon for him to have to leave home to train as a Taliban in Afghanistan. This was a common thing and continues to be a common thing in that particular area. So he did go and he began his training when he became of age. And I think it's kind of like it, when they get into their teens. But when he started his training, he was attempting to return home because he was very disillusioned by the Taliban. I think his personal beliefs were in conflict with what the Taliban were attempting to accomplish. Hamdi, who is an American citizen, before he was able to leave the Taliban, was actually captured in Afghanistan by the United States forces. So we know that he was trying to leave the Taliban, and we know that he was a United States citizen, but he kind of grew up in that culture and all of that. So he ended up getting arrested by United States forces. So after realizing the U.S. forces realized that he was an American citizen, what they ended up doing was that rather than keeping him in that country, they transferred him to Guantanamo Bay. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna sneeze. They ended up transferring him to Guantanamo Bay and denied access to legal. So they're kind of treating him like he's not an American, but he is an American. It was just a very strange way to deal with him. And I can kind of see it because it's kind of gray, right? So the argument was that there was a violation of the 14th Amendment, and he felt that they did they actually, another question was, did they actually have the authority to detain Hamdi, and wanted to know like which process is applicable for Hamdi because he's Saudi Arabian, but he's also an American, right? And so the court held that yes, there was a violation of the 14th Amendment, which is due process, right? That because he is a United States citizen detained as an enemy combatant, he had to have the opportunity, he should have been given the opportunity to contest his detention. And then there was this interesting shift too, because they said military force on American citizens in American soil is unconstitutional without the authorization of Congress, but does not apply to initial captures in the battlefield. So this is kind of going, oh, okay, get what happened here. You can capture them as long as you're in the battlefield, as long as you stay in that battlefield. But the moment you made the decision to transfer them to Guantanamo Bay, now we're dealing with the Constitution. So that was pretty interesting. All right, so when we're looking at this particular case, this was 4 men of British and Australian citizenship who were captured by American military forces in Pakistan and Afghanistan. They were denied they denied that they voluntarily joined any terrorist forces, but they couldn't deny that they had been fighting on behalf of the Taliban. But in their defense, they were saying, but we were forced to fight on behalf of the Taliban because we were captives ourselves. So if we didn't fight on behalf of the Taliban, they probably would have killed us, right? So they ended up getting sent to Guantanamo Bay. And the reason that they were sent to Guantanamo Bay is one of the things that you need to understand about Guantanamo Bay is that even though Guantanamo Bay belongs to the United States, they do not have full sovereignty because it's also shared, because it's also a part of or shared with Cuba. So this is kind of no man's land is what I'm really trying to say. Okay. So, yeah, yeah. Eh, political no man's land. That's what I'm going to say. So, their argument was that they felt that it was a violation of their 14th Amendment, also due process. So, what we find here is that the court held that since the United States has a small degree of control over Guantanamo Bay, the detainees do maintain the right to habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is tell me why, give me the body of evidence as to why you have detained me. Okay. And so they went on to say that foreign nationals held in Guantanamo Bay may petition federal courts for writs of habeas corpus to review the legality of their detention, which honestly, like this is the first time we waited until 2004 to say that, you know what, we might extend some of our constitutional rights to foreign nationals. This is huge because we have always said that the Constitution of the United States only applies to American citizens. And in this particular case, the higher courts have said, well, we're going to give them limited rights. And those limited rights is just basically giving them the right to find out as to why they are being detained. And those in U.S. territory have the right to bring suit in federal court. And then we've got United States versus Jones. Jones was being investigated for narcotics violations. The FBI attached a GPS tracking device. And I'm going to say that we've talked about this before briefly, but if we hadn't, and I don't know, maybe we have, just not in this particular course. Anyway, FBI attached a GPS tracking device on Jones's vehicle without a warrant. They tracked his movement for 4 weeks and then ended up charging him with selling cocaine. And this ended up in a life, he ended up receiving life in prison. Okay. So he says that this, unreasonable searches and seizures, and that the evidence was obtained without a warrant. So the higher court says placing a GPS device on a vehicle without a warrant is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. And this was actually the first case to involve GPS tracking by law enforcement. Because prior to that, we honestly, we didn't, this was the test case. All right, so let me give you some big highlights here. So the highlights for this particular chapter is that in Katz versus the United States, the higher courts made it clear the Constitution protects people, not places. So Katz did have an expectation of privacy, even though he was using a public telephone. Kylo versus United States, we learned that thermal imaging requires a completely separate warrant. And in Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, we found out that military force on American citizens in American soil is unconstitutional, and that the person being detained must have an opportunity to contest that detention. Russell versus Bush. This was the first time that we hear the higher court say that foreign nationals in U.S. territory have limited rights to review the legality of their detention. We're finally going to give them, we're going to grant them some of the constitutional rights that we normally grant our United States citizens. And then United States versus Jones. This is the first case that told us, no, GPS tracking is not going to be allowed unless you obtain a warrant. So I think that this particular group of cases that we reviewed really gave us a lot of guidance. I think the big alarm bell that is sounding here is that anytime that we're using technology to gather evidence, we now have to have a separate warrant for the use of that particular technology that's going to give us the evidence, right? Okay, so I'm going to end it right there. At least now we have the 5 cases in both of those chapters covered. And then when we meet on Friday, we'll be talking about some other things that we need to know in these particular chapters. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you in class.